Hello and welcome to another episode of Agri Matters. I'm your host, Sin Elim, and today on our podcast we have Chloe Dempsey, who's a research fellow at the Cellular Agriculture Society. So I'm going to hand it over to Chloe to just give us a quick introduction about herself as well as her research work.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and hello to all of your listeners. My name's Chloe, and I'm a postgraduate student at Peking University in Beijing in the Yanqing Academy, which is an interdisciplinary master's program where I'm completing a thesis in economics. And my thesis is really looking at Chinese consumer attitudes towards alternative protein, and more specifically, attitudes towards cultivated meat, which is one of the topics I'm sure we will get into today. And I've been living in Beijing for the last 4 years, so that's kind of a little bit of background to me. I'm from Ireland and Australia, both big agriculture export countries, so I always had an interest in the trade with China when it came to agriculture, and also had a personal interest in protein and in industrial animal farming. And this industry of alternative protein is set to be 138 billion is the most recent figure, US dollars, just for China's protein market in the next few years. So it's a real growth area. It's a really exciting area to be in. Everybody eats food. So that's kind of what attracted me to the area.
That's great. Well, I think the thing that is most topical right now is that obviously, everybody's kind of got COVID-19, they have the coronavirus pandemic on their minds. How do you think this coronavirus pandemic has potentially kind of changed people's attitude or interest towards alternative protein?
I think that alternative protein, generally speaking, at the moment is really experiencing a period of growth. And I think that COVID-19 has done nothing but to really accelerate that. Just today I was reading about how Starbucks is about to put out a new vegan plant-based menu that's going to be incorporating some really well-known brands in the area like Oatly. You've got Beyond and Omnipork, which is also coming from Asia. So it's a real growth area at the moment. And I think that COVID-19 has allowed people involved in the food industry to recognize we need to consider how volatile traditional animal agriculture is and traditional animal protein is, and consider alternatives. And that's what's really made the alternative protein industry so attractive. But at a consumer level as well, I think people are beginning to recognize the health risks, the environmental risks, the ethical impact of industrial animal farming, and they want an alternative too, and they want one that's healthy and that they can understand, and that kind of is a process that's beginning to happen. And I think at other levels too, apart from consumer level, apart from the food industry, I think at like a government and policymaker level as well. Policymakers are increasingly aware that they need to feed the world's future population, and to rely on an industrial animal industry which is really vulnerable to shocks like COVID-19, really vulnerable to infectious diseases, which obviously can also then pose a public health risk. They recognize they need to explore other options too. And I think that especially in China, it's not just COVID-19, it's African swine fever, which has ended up in 40% of China's pig herd being killed last year, and avian flu. And it's a series of events that are just beginning to mount up, and I think that it's making people recognize at all these levels, at the consumer level, food industry, policymaker level, we need to consider what alternatives are, and here we are now talking about alternative protein.
Great, that's a very good summary, because I was actually just going to ask, in response to sort of this groundswell of interest in alternative protein, would it be sort of, what does it take to get us to that kind of next level, right? Like, would it have to be kind of government intervention, right? Maybe fast tracking, the development of regulations. I know for one that, say, countries like Singapore have actually been, relatively kind of ahead of the curve in terms of trying to, come up with a proper framework so that industry can grow around it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Singapore is a really good example to look to, because Singapore tends to lead in policy broadly, and they have a policy of 30% by 2030, which is looking at food sovereignty and trying to be less reliant on imports, because obviously Singapore is a very small country, and so it's hard to provide for the food needs of the population, and things like alternative protein are allowing them to do so. So yeah, places like Singapore are really trying to fast track that regulatory process, trying to support industry, because really there needs to be movement at every level, kind of similar to how I said before. You've got to have regulations at a government level, you've got to have at an industry level you've got to have supply chains, you've got to have logistics there, but you've also got to have the development of the product itself, right? Which is very much still in the process for many companies. And then at a consumer level, you have to have acceptance, and you have to have a consumer that's willing to adopt the product, because ultimately that's how it's, whether or not it's going to be viable. And that's what I'm focusing on. But yeah, it requires movements at all those levels, and I think that is happening. But obviously, in some places more than others, and then there's also other actors who have a vested interest in keeping the status quo as well. So I think that somewhere like Singapore is being really proactive. I think that perhaps in other parts of the world, it might be harder to get that momentum going if there are roadblocks, and if that could come in the form of consumers thinking that products are unnatural. It could come in the form of incumbent meat industry and big agriculture lobbyists saying, well, we don't want to give away a piece of the pie. But there are really different attitudes, and I think that some players are willing to recognize that it's either be part of the disruption or be disrupted yourself, and adopting innovation as well. So that's really exciting to see too.
Great. So that actually touches on several things I'm hoping we'll dig into later on as well. But perhaps just to kind of take a step back and kind of go into the 101, if you will. Do you mind maybe just taking a minute to explain to our listeners kind of when you hear that term, alternative protein, like what does that actually mean, and how should they kind of think about the differences between that, say, alternative protein and conventional protein?
Yeah, that's a good question, Shinny, and I think that it's a question that some people in the industry are still grappling with, the kind of semantics and the language around alternative protein. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to get clarity. Alternative protein itself is really an umbrella term to refer to anything that wouldn't, I guess, traditionally be considered protein. So when we think traditionally, and this is, I think, a very Western perspective of protein, we think of animal meat, we think of dairy, we think of cheese and products like that. Coming from an Asian perspective, obviously, I think that is a lot more diverse. So you've got, firstly, plant-based meats or fake meats, mock meats that have been existing for thousands of years. You've also got tofu, which is a really common part of the diet. So that is kind of, I guess, what traditional protein means for a large part of the world. And then alternative protein is, really anything that isn't that. So that is like an easy answer to your question. I think generally speaking, at the moment, when people say alternative protein, they tend to be referring to three really major types of products. So the first of those is plant-based meat. So that's your Beyond Meat, your Omnipork, your Impossible, and then which is completely made from non-animal sources, but which seeks to imitate meat. And then you have got cultivated meat, which hasn't yet come to market anywhere, but which is actually growing meat just outside of the animal. And we can get into that a little bit more if you would like. And then the third area that often falls under alternative protein is also insect protein. So farming insects or using insects. And the products that come from insect protein can sometimes imitate meat or are sometimes completely new products. So yeah, there's a lot of diversity within the industry, but those three main areas, plant-based meat, cultivated meat, insect protein, tend to be what people are referring to when they talk about alternative protein.
Great. And there are also consumer products like corn. I've never tried it myself, but I've seen it in supermarket shelves. Didn't seem particularly appealing to me, but that's my personal taste. So I think there's also some startups kind of working in the area of mycoproteins. So that's kind of, it's not exactly plant-based, I guess, but it does come in a lab, but it's not dealing with animal cells per se. So it's kind of
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when you get down to the really nitty gritty, that is where, you know, you start talking about like, okay, well, what's the regulation behind this? What can we call this product? How does it apply to people who have like specific dietary needs or restrictions? And that gets really specific. But for a lot of these products, they are seeking to differentiate themselves from what has historically existed in very much the Western context as like vegan and vegetarian products. So corn, as you mentioned, has been around for a really long time. These new companies that are entering the market are really often seeking to provide an alternative to meat protein that really imitates meat protein and provides the same sensory experience, the same nutritional profile, if not better. So there is kind of a bit of a different generation of products that are coming out now as alternative protein. And a lot of people will also say like, plant-based meat 2.0 to recognize that there is a history of previous alternative proteins existing. Yeah.
And I think actually, what's interesting to note is that there's also been like a groundswell of demand from the consumer side. So we kind of mentioned it earlier on, in some industries where perhaps, you can't really count on, say, the government to be kind of leading the movement. I suppose in the end, it does have to come back down to the consumers, actually actively seeking out these products, which will then enable industry to kind of survive and flourish. So, it seems like, for instance, vegetarian, vegan diets, these have really gained in popularity over like the last 10, 15 years, right? So we've seen, internet queries for vegan, vegetarian diets. These have grown tremendously at kind of like a 16% and a 3% CAGR respectively. So do you think this sort of surge of interest is mainly due to ethical reasons, or, what do you think some of the other reasons are out there that are driving consumers towards these kind of diets, and why should they be considering alternative protein?
I think that ethical reasons are sometimes part of the equation, and I think that again, this is very much because my research is looking at cultural differences and historical relationships with meat and attitudes towards diet. But I think that, yes, in a Western context, often when we think of like, the vegan who won't eat anything or the vegetarian, we are very much thinking of somebody who's like on the moral high ground and they're doing it for ethical reasons because, all animals should be treated the same and so on, which is a perspective that I think hasn't always earned the sort of vegetarian or vegan movement a lot of supporters in some contexts. And I think that increasingly there's a movement of people towards plant-based diets that are based around health, that are based around environmental as well as ethical impact reasons. And I think that the language kind of reflects that as well. So moving from saying like vegan and vegetarian, which is like, well, if you even so much as accidentally use some fish sauce in a salad you just bought, then you are no longer a vegan or a vegetarian. And saying instead like plant-based diet, so where the overwhelming majority of your calories are coming from plant-based foods, and that's where you're getting your protein. And it's not, I think, such necessarily a strict kind of dogmatic perspective. And in that way, I think seeks to also encourage a lot more people into this movement as well. And a lot of these companies are saying, you don't have to eliminate all the meat from your diet, but we just want you to increase your reliance on plant-based protein instead. And guess what? It's going to provide you the same, if not better, experience at a sort of sensory level. And I think that, so aside from that kind of ethical perspective, there's also, the environmental perspective. Increasingly, people are coming to learn about how, livestock industry contributes to like 15% of global warming. It also contributes to numerous issues, whether it's in China, 20% of the world's population, 7% of its water. Environmentally speaking, we just can't continue to invest in this kind of industrial process with animals. And I think that, at a health basis as well, there's a lot of motivation there for people who are increasingly seeing that these companies are creating a product that has an improved nutritional profile in comparison to meat. So you're getting all the protein that you need, but you're also getting other nutrients that meat might not provide. And there are plenty of health issues associated with meat, not just public health issues like what we're experiencing now with COVID and zoonotic diseases, but also associated with issues like microbial resistance. So a lot of the meat that we're eating, especially coming out of countries like China and the US uses a lot of antibiotics so that they can continue to have these kinds of massive industrial farms where production is just happening constantly. And so you're consuming a lot of antibiotics. And I think that people are beginning to think to themselves, well, I don't really want to be consuming all these kinds of chemicals. I would rather have something that I know is completely, natural and then gone through a production process as opposed to being pumped full of chemicals. And microbial resistance also contributes to just like broader public health issues, which are emerging. Microbial resistance itself is going to be a huge issue in the future, and the livestock industry is definitely contributing to that.
Yeah, I think one segment where the consumers are perhaps getting a bit more aware of kind of like antibiotic use, apart from just sort of like farmed protein, right? Like when you think about your cattle farms, it's also in seafood, right? For instance, for shrimp, there's actually lots of cases where there's actually a very high concentration of antibiotics going into shrimp, and that actually has prompted, I think, people to start thinking about like, well, okay, could the field of alternative protein expand perhaps into, say, seafood, right? And I think people are also looking at kind of different inputs for alternative proteins, taking from the sea as well, like using algae, for instance. So it's all a pretty interesting space. I think one thing that people often think about with alternative protein or moving towards a more plant-based diet is perhaps kind of the cost function, right? Because I think it's pretty well documented, at least I think in the US as well, that a lot of the kind of lower income parts of the US, they're effectively like a fresh food or fresh produce desert, right? So it's very hard for people who are sort of on a budget to actually get access to the fresh produce that they would need if they were to transition to a more plant-based diet. So when you think about how kind of where alternative protein is today, could you maybe help us benchmark where kind of a cost, say, per pound for, say, lab-grown meat versus, say, conventional meat versus, say, plant-based protein would stack up?
Yeah, absolutely. My own research has very much been looking at cultivated meat. And I think that it's also important to note that different markets, there are different price points. So this is like very anecdotal. I mean, like I have heard from a lot of people that what they say when they go to buy, for example, plant-based meat, it's often more expensive than meat. So as you said, it's hard to provide a motivation for people to transition if they're having to actually pay more. And on that, there's actually some very interesting research that came out of the UK recently, which was by Chris Bryant, looking at how what people's attitudes are towards vegan and vegetarian diets. And people generally tend to agree or understand that, has a really positive impact on the environment, on ethics, perhaps on health as well. But ultimately, the barriers that are really there for people transitioning are those of price, taste, and convenience. And they think that, okay, well, if I want to, become vegan or something, then it's not going to be very tasty, it's going to be really expensive, and it's going to be inconvenient. And I think those are the barriers that the industry really needs to be able to overcome and make sure that they're able to communicate this to consumers. So in terms of the price point, this is, I think, very anecdotal, but at least when it comes to cultivated meat itself, there's a lot of different companies in the area. Everybody is making projections. Nobody is on the market yet, so I think that it's hard to really trust in the figures that are going around. But if you consider way back in 2013 when the first cultivated meat burger was debuted internationally, it cost over $300,000. Now, one of the main companies based out of Israel is saying that by 2022, they're going to have their mince at $10 a kilo. So while that is, of course, still expensive, it is reaching at some point price parity with conventional meat. And I think that what is important to remember is that the process and the technology behind alternative protein is continuing to evolve. And so it will get closer and closer to price parity with meat, and then it will overtake and become less expensive, most likely. There's so many ways to innovate. There's so many ways to extend that technology. Whereas with conventional animal farming, we have already reached the limits. You cannot push an animal any further than we already have. The amount of antibiotics and growth hormones that go into animals, you can't get a chicken to slaughter weight any faster. So there are gains to be made in alternative protein when it comes to price efficiencies, and there kind of isn't when it comes to industrial animal farming. So it's not really a case of if, but just when.
Yeah, I would agree on that. So you mentioned, there are a lot of startups sort of in the field, and some of them, like you mentioned, have been saying, in the last few years, right? Okay, we'll get there in maybe 3 to 5 years' time. When you sort of think about all these different startups, what do you see as the main differentiator between them? Is it kind of in terms of technology? I mean, apart from, obviously, I think in China, you see, guys like Omnicorp or Gen Meats, they're going more after pork, right? American players have typically focused more on, say, beef. But apart from, different choice of protein, what else do you see as a main differentiator?
I think that there's probably a few different levels that you could have a look at this question on. So, I mean, very much at the consumer level, it's kind of the things that you mentioned. So, what kind of animal meat are you producing or seeking to imitate? What kind of flavor profile? What kind of product? So, beyond it being just like pork or beef, it's also like, well, the rest of Asia doesn't eat hamburgers 3 times a week. So what kind of product as well are we actually producing? But then I think also it's important to take a step back and look at the sort of like production process as well. So while a lot of kind of alternative protein research may have started in the public domain, there wasn't really the funding to sustain that. And so a lot of the innovation and development that's happening is happening behind closed doors. And I think for that reason, it's hard to know exactly what are the main differentiators. And I think for some companies and startups, they have an interest in protecting, obviously, their intellectual property. But there are certainly very different production processes being used. So whether it's, when it comes to cultivated meat, for example, whether it's fermentation technology, or whether it's 3D printing, or whether it's tissue engineering, they're all really different production processes. And they might end up in a sort of similar product at the end, but the sort of efficiencies of those different processes, I guess, over time will become clear to have big differences. And I think also to then go into kind of looking at like logistics and supply, it's really important to recognize that there are some startups who might be doing, really awesome things, and they've got a prototype product out and it's really attractive. But how are they actually going to bring their product to consumers? And if you don't have any inbuilt relationships with supply and logistics, then it's going to be very hard to reach what is this huge market that you want to. So I think that in this sense, you've got traditional protein companies or big agriculture companies who have got a real home advantage because they already are in supermarkets. They already know how to engage with consumers. They've kind of already got that background. And I think that startups, while being very exciting, are going to have to find a way to either partner with big agriculture or develop their own relationships. But I think that's definitely a hard slog. So commercially thinking, I think that's a big difference as well. And yeah, obviously then from region to region, there are big differences. We talk about Asia, but what is Asia? It's so diverse, in terms of culture, but also just in terms of like the kind of economies we're looking at and the kind of meat that's eaten. And yeah, it's so complex to get into, but certainly there are major differences.
Yeah, I think in Asia, at least, some of the alternative protein players that I've seen, they've perhaps taken more of an approach of trying to go via plant-based. So we've got some that are using, say, jackfruit as a meat substitute, or lion's mane mushroom, all kinds of kind of plant-based alternatives with similar texture to meat. And then also, like you said, I think the product, the form factor is also pretty interesting to look at, because where like in the US, a lot of the consumers are consuming patties, right? So Beyond Meat, Impossible, Memphis, they all go for kind of like a patty shaped product. And then they go into like maybe nuggets or other kinds of like more typical snacks. In Asia so far, I've seen, for instance, Chinese startups, Filipino startups, they go for mince, right? So it's like minced pork. So something where actually potentially you don't really have to spend that much effort to try and reconstruct it and make it look aesthetically pleasing. And so you focus more of your R&D on maybe the taste, right? How to enhance that flavor profile of whether it's a plant-based substitute or if it is a lab-grown alternative, then how you match that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think that also, it stems out of obviously how different cultures use meat in their cooking as well. And I think that, having been being based in Asia, often when you encounter meat in a dish, it's like a garnish, or it's really just like to enhance flavor, as opposed to being like the center of the meal. So I think that sometimes for like Western companies, that's hard to compute, probably because they're not eating that every day. And even just like attitudes towards meat, like say for example in China, like eating certain types of meat at certain times of the year, or like connecting that to sort of like more holistic health is quite common, which at least I have never encountered in a sort of like Western environment. So it's very different cultural and historical attitudes towards meat and how you engage with that when you eat. So I think it's important to understand that so that you can really engage with the consumer.
And I mean, since we're on the topic of kind of different cultural attitudes, what do you think is the main difference in terms of consumer receptiveness to alternative protein in, say, in Asia versus in the West?
That is a really good question, which is essentially what my thesis focuses on. And I'm wrapping that up at the moment. I can't really share the findings from my thesis exactly yet because they're like going through the process of review with my university. But just to give an indication, I was looking at, depending on the description we provide consumers with, how accepting are they of cultivated meat? And yes, it looks very different to in the West. So previous studies that have been done in the US have looked at describing cultivated meat as something that's like, yeah, really an ethical or environmental choice. And a lot of the companies in the West, you can see that coming through in their messaging, and also in their founders are often like aligned with environmental or animal welfare movements. And in China, I would just say that framing and that kind of description is not what was most popular and like encouraged the most levels of acceptance. I think that some of the people I was talking to, I did qualitative interviews as part of my research. People looking at like investing in China and very much investing in food and innovation describe Chinese consumers as kind of more ruthless sometimes. Like they're really thinking about, okay, well, what is going to deliver the best value, but also have like, really good health benefits, and they're not kind of necessarily being motivated by the same ethical and emotive narratives that are still quite common in the West. And I think that perhaps there's something really that the West can learn from that perspective, because to go back to the research I mentioned before, people are not transitioning to vegan and vegetarian diets precisely because they're like, it's, inconvenient, it's expensive, and it's not tasty. So it's important to focus on those things and these kinds of intrinsic qualities rather than purely trying to appeal to people's ethical and moral sort of sense of self.
Got it. I mean, if we speak more broadly about consumers, so you mentioned previously, some of the barriers are sort of around price, and then also on the taste and convenience. And then earlier on, we also touched upon kind of regulatory frameworks, right? In some countries, maybe it's just a matter of, the regulation hasn't quite been sorted out. So it's hard to get these products to the market. Are there other sort of barriers that you see to consumer adoption of alternative protein consumption?
I think that you have probably ticked off the list there. I think that at the end of the day, it's also just about, I mean, we kind of mentioned this, but convenience. Like people might be really interested in alternative protein. They might have heard about it and they're really interested to try it, but ultimately it depends on how they're going to be able to access that. And I think like big chains, whether that's like Starbucks mentioning today about their new plant-based menu, or whether it's major supermarket chains in China or anywhere offering these products, give consumers the opportunity to engage with them. And I think that that's probably the stage we're really at now. It will be really interesting to see how this plant-based menu, for example, kicks off and how successful it is. But certainly with a lot of companies they have found a lot of success once they've actually been able to reach the consumer. I think that looking at an international company coming into China, you could have a look at something like Oatly, which is an oat milk, which has found huge support across China. And they had like a very strong entry strategy. They partnered with local brands. They really sort of built their brand up and targeted it to a Chinese consumer, and they've had massive success. So I think that it's important to go in with the right strategy and really just actually be able to reach your consumer, which I think can sometimes be a challenge.
I'm pretty impressed as speaking as a consumer and also observer in kind of Oatly's marketing strategy in China, because so I actually encountered Oatly when I was living in the US, and so there it was kind of like, okay, once in a while if like walk into like a cafe, sure, maybe the barista has it on the side, but I think in China they've been very aggressive in like pitching themselves as like the number one kind of like oat milk of choice for baristas, and they've also been very aggressive in partnering with kind of like the health influencers, getting in on the fitness community. So I do agree, I think it's actually maybe for the Chinese or the Asian consumer, it has to be also about a broader kind of package, right? It's not just tell me about the health benefits, but kind of sell me a broader kind of like lifestyle, right? Make it convenient, make it accessible, and then after a while you build up a habit, right? And you don't think twice about asking for Oatly in your latte the next time.
Absolutely. And I think Oatly is a strong example because dairy as well in China is experiencing so much growth. And despite that, Oatly has managed to really corner a huge part of the market. So, relatively speaking, for a product that is not actually dairy based. So I think that it provides a good case study of like, okay, yeah, meat consumption is rising, but Chinese consumers are willing to consider alternatives as long as you're able to pitch it in a way that is attractive to them. And like you said, it's the whole package. It's being able to go into Lola Cha and have like your Yamai, like bubble tea, which I sorely miss at this time.
Yeah, so do I. Okay, so I guess one other thing that I was curious about was because you've mentioned that you grew up, or you've been from sort of an Irish and Australian kind of background, which are both very large traditional kind of like farming communities, and then now in the field of researching alternative protein, you've probably seen a pretty wide span of I guess different protein sources and also practices. What are some of the most well, let's split it in two, right? So what is one, I think, a most promising area or most promising technology that you've seen that you think we should be keeping an eye out on? And two, kind of what is the weirdest or like wackiest idea that you've encountered so far?
I think that in terms of promise, I'm very focused on cultivated meat, but I think that Shop Meats, which is based out of Singapore, which is looking at cultivating shrimp meat, and then Avant Meats, which is based out of Hong Kong, which is also looking at seafood. Those are really exciting, and I think potentially with like Singaporean government support and so on as well, closer to market than companies that are looking to create a steak that's still got so many technological hurdles. Those are very exciting to watch. In terms of kind of wacky or weird, I think that alternative protein, to go back to the very beginning of our discussion, is so broad that it can really encapsulate anything. And I really love the sort of like big ideas that are coming out of these new food entrepreneurs and innovators. There's ideas like air protein, but probably for me, a favorite is Vow Foods based out of Australia, which is working on cultivating kangaroo meat. So kangaroo meat as well is also generally considered to be a healthier meat in Australia, really lean and has like a strong nutritional profile. So it just goes to show that, we don't have to limit ourselves to just recreating the meat that we have like traditionally engaged with. Alternative protein gives us an opportunity to, become a bit more exciting with our food consumption, and potentially also really improve the nutritional profile of the things we eat.
Yeah, I mean, I think kangaroo meat might be a little bit niche. I'm not sure if it's widely consumed outside of Australia. I
Not yet.
was thinking, Because we were talking a little bit about insects earlier, kind of back to the beginning of our conversation when you said that actually, that's one big bucket, right? So insects or kind of insect derived products. So there, I think, a lot of the startups that I've encountered, they seem to be mainly focusing on sort of on a 2B angle. So trying to, use insect as animal feed as a replacement for soy. Right, so that obviously has a huge kind of reduction of like the overall carbon footprint of say conventional animal rearing, but I think on the 2C side it seems that there is a little bit more of a hurdle in terms of getting acceptance. So there they tend to be a bit more just okay, let's just make it into like insect flour, it's cricket flour, it's all ground up, you can't see it, I'm gonna make it into muffins, and that's kind of the way to trying to sneak it in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, it really just comes down to framing at the end of the day. I mean, you could have a product on a plate, or you could have 3 different products and they might all look and taste so similar, but they could have completely different production processes, completely different origins in terms of ingredients. And so it's really just like very much, I think, a mental thing a lot of the time. And yeah, I love it. So it's such an interesting area to look at.
Great. So are there things that perhaps you've come across in the course of your research? So I know we can't talk about, say, the thesis specific kind of findings, but are there other things that you've encountered that you think might be interesting to share that we haven't spoken about so far?
I think that, yeah, it's such, looking at food and looking at like alternative protein touches on so many really critical issues globally. And I think an interesting issue to consider is how might alternative protein adjust depending on the context, not just in terms of like consumer acceptance and what consumers like, but also like how can we ensure that the benefits of alternative protein can really be enjoyed globally, and that this doesn't become a sort of elitist product that is purely existing for the gain of like big agricultural companies, and I think that alternative protein, and perhaps even the situation that we're in now, a situation of flux and major change, gives us an opportunity to try and think how can we recalibrate our food system, and think of a way that we can feed the world's future population, not just in the US and not just in Asia, but also just more broadly in the global South. And I think it's important to have that in the back of our minds when we think about these topics, and think not just how is it going to disrupt these agriculture giants, but also how is it going to disrupt the everyday smallholder farmer across a lot of parts of the world. So that is kind of, I think, that what like some of the issues I'm trying to think about right now. But yeah, it's such a broad area and it's a really exciting area to get into. I think that as a student, if any other sort of like young people or people doing studies are coming across this area, I'd really recommend that you get involved in the space, because it's a place where you can really have impact and also get to have really interesting conversations. And I'm always also happy to be reached out to as well.
Great. That sounds perfect. So I think that's a wrap. That's pretty much all the time that we have. And I think we've pretty much covered a very wide range of all things pertaining to alternative protein. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Janine. I hope that we can continue this conversation sometime in the future. Hopefully when my thesis is all completed.
Great. Well, all the best with your thesis defense.
Thank you.
Hopefully that got well in spite of all the uncertainty related to COVID.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me on today as well. I think that the whole concept of Agri Matters is really cool, and I'm looking forward to future podcasts.